Welcome back, everybody, to What a Concept, a show on this channel where we dive deep into our favorite concept records. And today we have a returning guest. He should be a familiar face at this point. We have Travis Lausch coming on in. And Travis, why don't you introduce yourself for anybody that hasn't seen you on the channel before? And also, what album are we diving deep into today?
All right, so just a little about myself. I'm Travis. I have a blog called Long Words on Song Words. It's just that.blogspot.com. I write a few articles here and there about prog music that I like. It's a bit of an offshoot of when I used to work for UltimateGuitar.com, one of the biggest music websites on the internet. I was writing album reviews for them regularly. I also did a YouTube channel under the name Long Words on Song Words. It's a bit on hiatus right now, talking about a potential return in the future. I'm also a musician. I write instrumental progressive rock and metal songs under the Borealia name. You can find my music on Spotify, Apple Music, Bandcamp. That about covers me. And the album that we're going to be listening to today is one of my favorite records of all time, and one with a concept that's just mind boggling.
Mhm,
It
mhm,
is B by Pain of Salvation.
mhm. Yeah, when you brought it to my attention, you said this was kind of a friendship litmus test for you.
Yes, I have definitely shared this album with some people very close to me and gotten some mixed reactions from them for
Mhm,
sure.
mhm.
And the ones that react very strongly, both positively and negatively, it kind of tells you a bit about the person from their reaction and whether or not they're my kind of people.
Okay, that's fair. That's fair. So, I guess why did you choose this one? Without going into like the spoilers of the concept or the music about
Yeah,
that, like why this album?
because in a way, doing this with you and having this concept opened up a bit, me reading into it a little more, maybe it'll help me better understand the concept as well, because this is a really it's an intricate concept album, and it's one with a lot of layers to it beyond just a narrative or a single theme.
Mhm,
And, the other reason is I just love this album. It's so
mhm.
different. It's so, like, different on a lyrical level, of course, but also different
Sure.
on a musical level from so much of what was in the prog metal scene at the time. They really were kind of forging their own path and really just trying something completely different with this record. And, it divided their own fans a bit, but I think if you ask Pain of Salvation fans about this record now, the majority tend to be a lot softer on it, considering the albums that came afterwards.
Yeah. And
So
that
yeah,
was yeah, that was something I was going to mention. Like this is a very interesting album in the Pain of Salvation discography in terms of like the timeline, because this is following up in many fans of the bands. Like it's following up two of their best records. You
yeah,
got The Perfect Element Part One in 2000. You got Remedy Lane in 2002. So like
and I
a
mean,
lot of. Mhm.
you could even stretch it back to the first two records, Entropia and
Sure,
1 Hour by the Concrete Lake. It's kind of like Metallica's first four records. Pain of
sure.
Salvation has a Metallica's first four records kind of deal.
You're also kind of right in like afterwards, Scar Sick and Road Assault 1 and 2 and Falling Home, I think was. I feel like I'm missing something right in the
Yeah,
middle there.
Linoleum EP,
Yeah, yeah,
that was in
yeah.
there.
Oh, and wasn't there also On the Two Deaths or something like that as
That
well?
yeah, that was a live album.
The live album, right,
Yeah.
right, right. So like this is kind of like a pretty big transitional kind of period where you have like these really big staple records. Like it's so interesting because I came into Pain of Salvation with Scarsick. That was when I was doing a lot of deep dives into prog at that point. And I was just like, this is the band that everybody's falling over themselves
And
for.
I don't think you could have picked a weirder entry point than Scarsick. I mean, if
Yeah.
if Scarsick was the first album from them I'd ever heard, I
Yeah.
probably wouldn't be as big of a fan of the band as I am today.
And like that's I've always struggled with Pain of Salvation, and like I've seen them live I think twice now, and I've loved them play live, and I always used to say like Daniel Gildenlow, the lead singer, songwriter, and musician, like kind of like the the Robert Fripp of the band. I love him when he's playing in other people's sandboxes. I loved him when he was helping out with the Flower Kings and Transatlantic. I love when he's guest appearing on like Efrat, and I think he did some stuff with Arion as well. When it came to Pain of Salvation, because I had only known Scarsick, Road of Salt 1 and 2, and then I eventually went back and I listened to Remedy Lane and The Perfect Element. Like I never really connected to them in the same way that I think a lot of prog fans and especially like metal prog fans do. So I was always kind of hesitant because I never actually sat down and listened to B because I was always like, whoa, this one seems a little weird following up Scar. I'm just gonna put that to the wayside. Yeah, when you said, okay, let's do B, I'm like, okay, I'll go in with an open mind because, their last two records of Panther and In the Passing Light of Day, I really enjoyed those ones more.
Yeah, and I mean,
So
a lot of fans would consider those two albums a strong return to form for them.
absolutely. So I'm kind of excited to talk about it. And as you mentioned, kind of like work out my own thoughts because I've been with this record now for a couple of weeks ever since you pitched it to me. So
Ah, yeah.
you're unlike a lot of the albums that we've covered where I have a much more of a deeper pool to draw from within my experience. We're getting it fresh. We're getting it,
We're going in
freshly
raw.
fermented. We're going in raw. We're going in raw. Yeah, now that we kind of know, where this album is within the band's discography, what it kind of meant, this came out in, was it 2004? I think it was.
So yeah, 2003, 2004. It's
Yeah.
2004 on the CD.
Right. Okay, perfect. So like yeah, prog metal was in a very interesting place at that time. So that's kind of like the cultural touchstones, right? That's where we're kind of at. Let's talk about the concept then. Let's dive
Oh boy.
into the bigger part of this. And when you first mentioned to me about this, and we were talking, I think we were even talking about our favorite concept records, just in general. You were like, "Oh, I love B because it's basically just like a creation myth." I'm like,
It is, kind
what?
of.
What?
It's
So yeah,
it
unpack that. Unpack that. What
oh
are we
wow,
talking
it's like
about?
there's so many layers of idea. I don't even know where I'm going with the words for this, but like there's so many idea layers of
Mhm,
this concept album. And it really does start off as a creation myth. You have that first breath and I am, that consciousness first coming into being. And, that's sort of like a representation of the beginning of everything, the beginning of the universe, the beginning of God. In
mhm,
fact, this first track even sort of establishes that this first consciousness is, I will call myself God.
mhm,
And that in order to understand itself, in the album's narrative, this god figure is given the name Anima. It creates imago, humanity, to be an image of itself and to learn about itself from imago. Things are pretty good in the beginning. We multiply, we keep ourselves connected to each other, but as we mature as a species, we start to engage in behaviors that are maybe not so conducive to staying connected with our spiritual roots. We sin more.
mhm, mhm.
We start to destroy our environment for our own personal gain. And as the narrative of the album progresses, I mean, for one, there is a bit of a sort of layer of like connection to one's spiritual roots. This isn't a religious record, there isn't any specific symbolism to any one particular god or religion, but it's very deeply rooted in a very spiritual kind of vein, our connection to the beyond,
Mhm.
whatever that is for you.
Yeah, we're
And
not dealing with a Neil Morse record where it's
this
like the
is not Neil
Judeo-Christian
Morris.
God. It's like we are talking about Jesus,
And
right? It's Like,
and even our idea of sin on this record is not necessarily Christian ideas of sin. It's
mhm,
things like
mhm,
just looking out for ourselves instead of one another. And this leads to, the greed of our only human character in the narrative of this record, Mr. Money, who
mhm.
is, I guess, this story's sort of exposition of someone like Jeff Bezos or Elon Musk, the richest man on earth,
Right.
the big, charismatic, multi bajillionaire. And if you listen very carefully in the background of certain things, you hear things about like cryogenic freezing.
Mhm,
And this is kind of what his whole shtick is he's going to popsicle himself and
mhm,
wake up once we've discovered the cure for everything and fixed nature and
mhm.
created all the grandest of technology, and he will emerge from it once again as a king. But while he's going through that, humanity is engaging in wars. We're engaging in destruction of our environment. Humanity is losing faith in its spiritual roots. That's especially apparent in probably the most evocative and emotionally driven track on this record, Vocari Day.
Mhm.
I don't know if I want to talk about what makes that particular track special now, or if we're going to save that for another
We can
part,
we
but
can we can we can put a pin in that and come back to it for sure. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Because I
let's
think
do
at this
that.
point we're
Because
just
that's a
gonna
really,
it's pretty
it's a
deep, right?
heartbreaking track.
Yeah. So we need to we're just taking a bird's eye view, right? We're just covering the basics here.
And so as humanity is both actively wiping itself out, but also multiplying. We get to like this is something here that I don't know if it'll show up on camera or anything, but we get into like there are 6 or 7 pages in the CD booklet. I
Hmm.
gotta find it here. It's not in the CD's booklet. It's in. I got another prop for this. The live DVD,
Uh-huh. Yep, yep, yep.
which has a very large program booklet, and there are several pages about the concept,
Hmm.
you know, like big, like
Oh yeah.
multi-paragraph things, points of departure,
Hmm.
just with various phrases. Things like no being can remember the state of not being. Every being with an intellect will strive to understand itself. Keywords, theories, and concepts. There's even a page, I kid you not, of academic and literary sources.
Oh, there you go. Well, I
There you
love it. I
go.
love I love the
It's a
work that cites its sources.
it's
That's always great.
deeply researched. But one of the key concepts that kind of came up, and it's something you notice in the lyrics, is there's a population count that goes on through this record,
Yeah.
where it details how many people there are, and of course, like at the beginning of the album, it's talking about our rise up, and then like up to like 500 million people in like the 1800s, and now we're in the year 2000, 6,080 million people. Like that's a big jump. As the album progresses, like we're at a
Hmm.
state where we're actively wiping ourselves out with wars and destruction and famine, and yet our population continues to climb, through
Hmm.
the next several decades. We're getting up to 9, 10 billion people.
Hmm.
And there was a key concept and phrase in the liner notes that stood out to me: carrying capacity.
Yeah.
Eventually, any system that outgrows itself will collapse. And that's why in one of the final tracks, we learn that humanity is decimated down to 1 million
Right.
people.
Right.
That's
Yeah.
that's not even a quarter of the population of Toronto.
Oh yeah. Yeah, yeah,
You
yeah. I
know?
mean, it's what is it? The second law of thermodynamics. The one thing that I really enjoyed about this album, as I think all concept albums, is you do have this kind of top layer concept of the relationship
Yeah,
between kind of the divine and the mortal. You have
yeah.
and how that fluctuates both ways, right? Because it starts off with the initial breath. It starts off with the initial being. And then from there you have the creation of those who are made in their image, and then that how that relationship kind of goes back and forth. What I really struck towards, and I'm glad that you brought it up, where it was talking about we all strive, like conscious beings all strive to remember the first time that we had consciousness. It's like we don't remember a time that came before us. In that sense, it's like we've always been here, even though we can't remember how it was. And it reminds me of a quote, and I believe it was from Hank Green, that
Oh,
says,
wow.
isn't it wonderful and beautiful that the universe created something to observe itself?
Yes.
So, and
I
that's
mean,
kind of like the main
we
linchpin
are
for this.
Stardust.
Yeah. So it's like we are here to observe and to experience this universe. And it's like that is kind of where this whole consciousness is. A couple weeks ago, I was diving really deep into Neil Morse's One because I just got the vinyl, and it's like those two concepts play very well. It's like, God splitting off into God and man and then coming together at the end. And, there's a lot of things that could be drawn within that. So that's kind of like the top layer, right? And then
Yeah.
underneath it, you have how that all is interconnected and how all that is interwoven within everything.
Really, the crux of the concept of this album is how we connect with each other and
Hmm.
how we connect with our universe and
Hmm.
what the consequences could be of us trying to separate ourselves from it. We haven't even gotten to the ending of the narrative yet, which involves Mr. Money
Yep.
waking up from his cryo sleep, seeing that the world around him is ground to dust, dirt, and stone, and I
Hmm.
quote, and that he really did fulfill his wishes. He came out as the top of every hierarchy.
Yeah.
He is the last one alive. And then the very ending is kind of ambiguous because there's talk of Nauticus, which is this space probe. It's not really like defined in the lyrics, but
Hmm.
it's meant to be like a probe that's sent into space to gather all of the data to save humanity from itself. There's this really ambiguous ending where it's implied that somehow Nauticus takes that first breath of sentience and declares, I am to the universe. It is now
Yeah.
God.
Well, in
Which
my
is, it's an interstellar ending for sure.
it is. And in my mind, and again, this was only me with it for maybe about, 3 weeks max. In my mind, that was the cycle continuing of man creating something again at which to observe the reality at which it was created in. And then
In
through
order
that,
to understand itself, yeah.
correct. And then through that, the cycle continues where it takes the first breath of not just observing and reporting, but observing and understanding. And that's kind of that whole breath of consciousness. And again, it's that I don't know. I know that there was a me before the consciousness. I don't remember that.
Right.
Right.
I never really thought of that. That's a good shout. And
Yeah.
even though I don't think it's ever mentioned anywhere in the liner notes, I wonder if we're kind of heading in that direction with the advent of artificial intelligence.
Yeah. To
With
a point, I think. Yeah. To a
there may
point.
come a point where
I think we'll get to a point where it's indistinguishable, but I don't. Yeah. I think that's a conversation for a different day.
I'm hoping
Uh,
for more like I'm hoping for more Lieutenant Commander Data than
right.
Skynet.
I think we all can agree that that's the better way to go. We've kind of nailed down a little bit within the concept. Let's
Uh,
talk a little bit more about the music and
Oh
how the
boy.
music helps to both reinforce but also help tell the story, continue the concept of it. And I was wondering if there was somewhere you wanted to start jumping off with.
I really do think that the music does a good job of telling the story
Hmm.
because, we start off with this very, dramatic progressive metal piece, Deus Nova, but that's really just like the setup for the story. Once we get into the real beginning of the meat of the story, we have Imago, which is this very folky, tribal, it's very free and it's powerful and expressive, but it's all very acoustic. It's very percussion driven, lots of
Hmm.
acoustic guitars, and I think Christopher Gildenlove plays double bass instead of bass guitar in it, which I'm a newbie to double bass, so I'm kind of like, oh, I love seeing that in prog.
Hmm.
And then we have Pluvius Estivus, which is the big piano. It's very classical, very
Hmm.
elegant. But as things start to sort of turn for humanity, the music gets darker. Then we have, the more dramatic kind of tracks like Lilium Cruentus, and, Nauticus goes back to that sort of acoustic thing, but now it's more from the point of view of like, whereas Imago is this very lively and free and rich kind of piece, Nauticus is almost kind of harking back to like old African slave trading
Yeah.
kind of music, like the kind of music that those in the slave trade would have written. And it's more of a plea, kind of a please save us from ourselves kind of thing.
Yeah, for me, it was at this point that I realized, like, I don't know if this was intentional or if it was just kind of a product of the music that they were going through, but like up until Nauticus, it was like a progression of music development in human history.
Yes,
So you have the first couple of tracks that are, as you were mentioning, very percussive, and essentially that's all that we had was just
tribal
like,
and
yeah, like banging sticks together, smacking rocks together, and that type of thing, and some kind of just making a rhythmic beat, right? And then once we get into Imago, you're starting to develop that a little bit more. I'm almost surprised that we don't get any like to like monk chanting, because that was like really big in the Middle Ages and whatnot.
but that's
Um,
kind of like what Nauticus is in a
and that's
way.
kind of what, yeah, because Nauticus is like the music that we kind
Oh
of got that were,
Lord,
yeah, and so like
won't
you
you
got
hear a sinner's prayer?
it. It did remind me of like worship music, specifically around what that we would
Yeah,
find in very passionate churches.
yes,
And I really enjoyed a lot of the, like, the classical movements that are kind of found throughout as
yeah.
well. And I mean, we're getting a lot of violins, we're getting a lot of string moments in there.
What's really cool is that also credited in this album, it's not just Pain of Salvation, it's Pain of Salvation with the Orchestra of Eternity. It's a
Hmm.
nine-piece orchestra. Orchestra in
Yep.
air quotes, because like nine pieces is not an orchestra, but yeah, you've got a couple of violins, a cellist, a double bass, some flutes, some woodwinds, some I think even a tuba player,
Hmm.
although you
Hmm.
can't really hear him in the record. The music is so elegant at so
Hmm.
many points. But
Hmm.
then you get like now we're getting into sort of the meat of the story, and we have Dea Pecuniae. It's the Elon Musk moment of big boisterous. Here's to me.
Yeah, which is
I'm the best.
it's so interesting because musically this is probably my favorite point in the album.
Oh, it's definitely up there for me too.
It's so much fun. Here's to a society at which the system itself was what brought me up. It's
And
like
you're
I
here
am.
to serve me.
It's like this whole thing is made of cogs and wheels, and I was just the sole benefactory of it. So like the actual idea is everything that I hate about people, but the
Yeah.
music itself is things that I absolutely love. So it's got this like really big like juxtaposition between the lyrics and the actual music itself.
And I got to give some heavy props in that track to Cecilia Rinkvist, who's
Hmm.
the female vocal guest on that track. Um,
Hmm.
it's kind of funny. I love the story of this. Is that this is like someone from Pain of Salvation's hometown, absolutely no like fame to her whatsoever, but they're just like, we love your voice. We want you on our record, and that would be like if Dream Theater, brought in like some local Long Island opera singer who's
Right.
never sang on a metal record before, never had any kind of fame, and just like, hey, have at her. I
Yeah.
love when artists do that and bring in like just completely unknown people and give them the
Hmm.
spotlight like that. Now we get to the track that I was going to mention before, Vocari Dei,
Yeah. Let's do it.
Di Day, and oh, this is like a heartbreaking track. So the story behind this is that the band set up a phone line in their
Mm.
studio and encouraged members of their fan club to call and leave their messages to God. Some of the messages that were left are very impassioned and very emotional. They had so many submissions. Reportedly, Mike Portnoy
Hmm.
even called, and they
Yeah, I
didn't
could
use
see
his
that. I
track.
could see that. Like I know that. Well, I know. Oh shoot, when was Systematic Chaos? Was that 2007?
Yeah, oh
Yeah,
six oh
because
seven.
yeah, that's when they had the the 12 step suite where they asked a bunch of friends to like chat about some of the regrets that they had. And it's almost like, oh, did Mike Portnoy take that idea from here and just wanted to put it right there? Because he does that a lot.
Well, Daniel Gumlow actually was one of the voices on that Dream Theater track too. So,
Yeah.
um,
Yeah.
yeah. So from here until basically the end, the next few tracks are some of the heaviest ones on the record because this is the period where humanity is like actively raging against its spiritual roots and where it's actively destroying itself and
Yeah, because like that track, Vicardi man, I I believe all these tracks
Vocari
are,
Day. I just
yeah,
say Day.
I believe that all these are Latin, right? Like I want to
They
say
are
that
all
all these
Latin,
are
and they're
Latin
all
because
the Latin is like completely weird in this.
oh
It's
jeez.
purposely weird. Like
Right.
one of the tracks is Nile Morari, and
Hmm.
it translates to nothing remains, but it's the other meaning of the word remains, like remains, leftovers,
I
the
see. I see.
remains of something. So it
Gotcha.
sounds like it
Gotcha.
makes sense, but it doesn't.
Right. It's
Um,
almost like you cut and paste into Google Translate back in like 2004, you know, and it's
and
just
yet
like
but it's
it
on purpose,
works, but it's
purportedly.
yeah, 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 yeah. Just with this Vicardi, like that is really the split, and it's not just because it's kind of the halfway mark at the eighth track of 15 pieces.
Yeah,
Um, it is the split because this is kind of like the crisis of faith. You know, it's all these people, and a lot of them are heartbreaking. Like one guy legit just breaks down and starts crying, and it's when you're at your wits end, it's just before, narratively, it's just before the turn. It's just before, the hero or the villain or whatever enacts their big plan or, the big challenge is
yeah.
put into place. And it's like, okay, here's where you had two roads in front of you, right? And you decided to go on the one road. And
And, and it's weird because it's one of the shorter and musically simpler tracks on the record.
mhm,
On
mhm.
any other record, this would be considered like an interlude track or something, and yet
Yeah.
it's kind of the linchpin for the whole second half.
Mhm. Yeah,
It's
if
what really
like
sets up the rest of the record.
absolutely. Like this would be kind of like what opens up like a second overture in a Neil Morse band. I don't know why I keep going to
There
Neil
you
Morse.
go.
For me, it's always so interesting when I hear these types of prayers, especially when it comes to like the whole concept of this album and, our relationship to the divine. And when they're talking about, especially within all these, these prayers. And it's like, well, if you're a being of love, how are you able to allow all this suffering? Why can't I just do all this stuff? And I was raised religious, and the one thing that they really kind of hammer it into you is like God gave you free will. Anytime you see hate, anytime you see pain, anytime you see all those things, that is a consequence of your own free will. I always want to just kind of take these people aside and be like, God is there to guide you, but he's not there to make things all bright-eyed, bushy-tailed, and rainbows. Because
Right.
if he did that, then he would be contradicting his number one rule, which is, I have bequeathed unto you free will. It's one of those things. It's like, we're the reason why these things are happening. It's humanity that has the hate. It's humanity that has the pain. You can lean on God to help alleviate that. But if he were to remove that, he undercuts that whole free will aspect. So
Right.
I think it's that kind of understanding that then brings us over into the differentia, which is kind of like, well, if you're not intervening, that must mean that you don't have any stake in this and that you don't care.
And
Right.
that
And it's
I
like,
will never submit to all the things you've said, God.
exactly, exactly. It's like, well,
If
yeah,
you want me dead, I'm right here.
right?
Like,
It's like, well, there's the point, and you're way out over there. It's like you
yeah.
completely missed the point by a full nautical mile. That was one aspect of this album that I'm just like, okay, I love that they're able to kind of really distill this aspect of like where I get aggravated when people are like, oh, well, I prayed to God and nothing happened because, I wanted Joe Schmo from across the way to stop revving his, you know, motorcycle at 3 a.m., right? It's like, well, of course God's not going to do anything because he would undercut his free will. You go over and talk to Joe Schmo.
There you
Anyway,
go.
I had to get that out of my system
I
because that's
That's great. I mean,
yeah.
I wasn't raised religious. I know,
Mhm.
controversial, but
Yeah, it is
um
what it is.
yeah, no, I get that. I appreciate that point of view. That disdain for the deity, it kind of it manifests in the heaviness of the following tracks.
Oh,
And then
absolutely.
and when we get to Omni, it's like now we have like this church hymn with the organ, and
Mhm.
we're not just like angry anymore, we're desperate. The sound in that, like the dissonance in the music, from a music theory perspective, some of those chords just don't make any sense, and
Yeah.
but it's this desperate plea of like, please save us.
Yeah, and the thing that I loved about Omni was sonically, like you can tell that's an empty church. Like you can hear through our harmonics the difference between a full church and an empty church.
Yeah, that's
And
a real church organ.
that's a real church organ. And like I
Yeah,
know Arcade Fire has done the same thing where they recorded on their Neon Bible record, they recorded one track with a completely empty church when they were using the church organ.
right.
Uh and then another track where it was full, and you can hear the
Oh,
difference just sonically because of the actual like reverberations of people
yeah.
being in a church. And like Omni is an empty church, and it's like we are now desperate.
And then it leads to that whole ending with Iter Impius, where
Mhm,
uh, Mr. Money comes back, and I kind of like how Dea Pecuniae and Iter Impius are two very, very different songs,
mhm,
and they have a very different feel, but they both do very similar things. That
mhm.
because like our Mr. Money guy is, the richest man in the world, he's Mr. Charisma. Everything is so dramatic, and it's almost like Disney dramatic.
Yeah.
And especially like at the very end of De Pecuniae, like they do the big rock and roll ending with the big drum fill that never ends, and the vocalist going, oh, 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 yeah. And, all that going on for like a minute and a half. Even though Iter Impius is more of this somber, melancholy, the world is over and I am the last man alive kind of ballad, it also has that, you know, ending that just goes on, and it's desperate, and it's angry, but it keeps going, and it's big and boisterous. It's exactly how Mr. Money would end a song or his life. We don't really know what happens to Mr. Money at this point.
Yeah.
But we do know that the next track, Martius Nauticus 2, all of a sudden, because we're going back to that whole thing of the I am, the first breath of creation from a new entity trying to understand itself, and the music actually, I think this is really really neat. It kind of devolves over the
Mhm.
space of the track, where we start out with something very, maybe not metal but heavy, something that has like really heavy guitars, and then eventually we get into this more impressionistic sort of acoustic piece with this almost Arabian kind of flavor to like the flute and the guitar. And then as it keeps going, we get back into this really light, airy, folky section that's actually a section from Imago. And then it ends on just drums,
Yeah. Yeah,
just percussion.
I really appreciate how it kind of devolves right back to almost nothing. And then, the last bit of that last track is just silence
Yeah,
until you get that final kind of breath and that whole I am, kind of bringing it back.
it's bringing
And
it back, and the cycle
yeah,
continues.
like the thing that I remember, like thinking, especially the first couple of times when I was listening to this and thinking the album was over, it was almost like back in like the early 2000s where you would realize that the CD is counting down rather than counting up within the
Yes.
track lengths.
Oh, I
It's
miss
kind of like,
that.
yeah, the hidden tracks.
The pre-gap.
Uh, that's right, the pre-graph stuff. I love those. But it also reminded me of one of my favorite pieces of media that has ever happened, which was Mr. Rogers, where he just told the kids, because his audience is children, we are just going to sit and watch my clock for a minute. We're not going to do anything. We're not going to show you anything. We're just going to sit and we're going to take in the moment. And literally just sat there for a full minute as you watch the ticket, like the seconds
Like the
tick.
last episode of his show?
No, no, no. This was
Or
like one
just
of his, just a random episode where he's just
oh,
like,
okay, yeah.
I think we
I don't
just
think I've seen that
need
one.
some. Yeah, it's just like we just need some time, and I want to show you how long a minute is because time is so subjective. This minute, even though it's not any different than any of the other, 23 minutes that is going to be happening in this show, this is going to be the one that feels the longest because it's not being taken up by anything. And
Right.
it really allows you to reflect. And I love the fact that he took that time to kind of show kids in a very real way, hey, time is actually subjective and things can feel longer if you're not doing anything, but that allows you to take stock. And that is why I believe at the end that time is allowing this entity that we created to come into its own
Right.
sentience, you know? Because that's that final, oh, I've taken in all this information and now I understand and now I can reflect.
Right.
And what does it decide to reflect? Well, the creator. That's one of the big concepts that I love about this record is like, even though the creator made humans in its own image, did we try to aspire to be godlike in our own actions? And so
Right.
again, that's one of the things that I love playing with within this concept and within this album.
And that's only one of like many interpretations that you could go
Mhm.
with this record. There's so many, as it says in the liner notes, layers of creational sawdust to um, to unpack about this record. I mean, we could redo this video again for another looks like 45 minutes we've been recording, have a completely different conversation here.
No,
So,
absolutely.
I mean,
Yeah.
that's one of the things about this record that blows my mind. I mean, is it a bit of a pretentious concept? Hell yeah. I mean, I think even Daniel himself kind of says it's probably the most pretentious concept album he's ever
Yeah.
made.
Yeah.
But
And
but it's
I think
so deep and so well researched.
yeah. Yeah. I think in that note, we can actually move into the final part before we get into the big platinum concept album test, which is any negatives that are found on here. Like
Oh,
this is in my mind, this is all the best and worst things about prog, capital P prog metal, right?
mm,
Like you mentioned,
right.
it's super pretentious. It's the pretentiousness without the kind of tongue in cheek. And that works to its
Well,
benefit.
The Mr. Money thing is pretty tongue in cheek. There's
There
some of
is.
it.
Yeah, but like the tongue in cheek that I'm kind of talking about is like the, oh, we know this is over the top, right? It's like, oh,
Yeah,
we know that this is ridiculous. And I'm kind of glad that they didn't go that route because I feel like that distills sincerity. That is one thing that I really applaud this record for is its sincerity. This is just before the big um sincerity downfall that we would have where everything had to be serious. Everything had to either be serious or it had to be like the turning to the camera and winking that a
yeah.
lot of comedies, in the early to mid 2000s would have, you
it
know.
either it either had to be Steven Wilson,
Yeah,
Steven Wilson, Nothing in Life Matters, or
yeah.
Devin Townsend, Nothing in Life Matters.
Yeah, exactly. That's what I was kind of thinking. And like, I don't want to point to any one media, but like it reminds me of like the Dark Knight trilogy with Christopher Nolan, where it was like dead serious, like grandma being hit by a bus serious. Or you had like DreamWorks or The Office,
Yeah.
which was constantly the characters being like, right? And I'm just like, that's not a joke. That's lazy writing. Anyway,
Right.
that's beside. I'm so glad that we finally moved past that. We
Yes.
were talking about the negatives of this album. We were
The
talking about the
negatives.
negatives of this album. So for you, is there any negatives about this album that you want to bring forth? Like something that, kind of either grites on you or, we'd already talked a little bit about the pretentiousness of this album, but anything else that kind of comes out?
Not really. I mean, this is one of my favorite albums of all time, so I'd be hard
Mhm.
pressed to kind of think of anything about it that I really strongly dislike. I think maybe one of the things that I don't much care for is just how connected the pieces are in such a way that it's hard to listen to like one track from this album out of context. You wouldn't necessarily say a track like Volcari Day is your favorite song because it
Yeah.
really requires the context of the tracks around it to work.
Also, if
Um,
somebody said Vakari Day was their favorite track, I'd be like, "What's wrong
wrong
with
with
you?
you.
That's your favorite track?" It's like, "Oh, I just
It's
love hearing people break
definitely
down."
it's definitely the most evocative track on this record for sure.
Oh, for
But
sure,
yeah,
for sure. Yeah.
I
Well, it is
mean,
interesting. Like I saw within because I listen to my music on Spotify, Iter Impius, so I can pronounce words. Um, it has over like 600,000 streams, whereas all the other ones are kind of hovering around the 100 or 200,000 streams.
yeah, I mean
So
that track is probably about the closest thing this record has to a single.
yeah,
I actually need like to remember the titles because they're all in Latin. That's another negative.
that is
Lilium
another.
Cruentus is kind of its own thing too.
Yeah, and I think the only other one that kind of comes close as like a high stream rate is Amago with like
Yeah,
4.3 hundred thousand.
it is one of those albums where, it's hard to listen to it casually.
Yeah.
It's not a casual listen. It's a deep involved listen
Yeah,
that
and I think oh go for it, finish it up.
to me it's like akin to, the difference between buying a cheap painting to hang on your wall and being able to look at it whenever you want and just like, oh cool, that's a piece of art on my wall, and going to the Louvre to see the Mona Lisa. I'm not saying that this album is the Mona Lisa in terms of quality, but
Yeah.
it's a very involved record. You're not just
Yeah.
casually looking at it and going, "Oh yeah, that's cool." You are deep diving into it every time.
Yeah, and like I would
Otherwise,
take
you're not getting out of it what you would what you're putting in really.
yeah, yeah, and I mean a lot of concept albums are like that. I would kind of interpret that as like this album is a really strong and solid listen from start to finish, but there's no like as we were mentioning before, there's no strong like single. You wouldn't take any of these tracks and listen to them in isolation like you could with, say, I always lean on these albums because they're the most obvious ones, but like Tommy from The Who, where you can listen to Pinball Wizard, or like The Wall from Pink Floyd, where you can listen to Comfortably Numb. This doesn't quite lend itself to that same way. And I think it's part of the reason because this album has and I hear a lot of people talking about albums in this way, like this has a very high flooring, so like all the tracks are very good, but it also has a
Right.
fairly low ceiling in that no track really rises above
There
outside
isn't a
from,
standout.
yeah, like outside for me, which is
Dea
Pecui.
Pecuniae.
Thank you, Di Pecui.
Dea
um
Pecuniae, yeah.
that's the one, that's the one.
I think
um
that's the only track on the record I think that actually says the title in the lyrics.
which is very helpful. But like that's the only one for me that I would like go back in singularity to.
Yeah,
And I wouldn't necessarily call that a negative per se, but it is one that I am conscious of. It's
right.
like, well, I'm not going to go back and, as you mentioned, casually listen to this album. I'm not going to have this as like a background listening. This is going to be like an album that it's like, oh, I want to sit down and get into the concept and think about it.
This is a straight up vinyl listen. Um, I guess another really small negative for me, it's a really small negative because I've only seen them live once,
Mhm.
is that they don't really play anything from this record on
No,
stage.
and uh
Diffidentia is on the Two Deaths of DVD,
hmm
and it's rearranged because now they play seven string guitars in A tuning,
ah,
whereas on
right,
this
right,
record
right.
everything's in C minor. Now everything's in A minor instead. So they rearranged the song for live
Right.
performance.
Yeah, and I
But they
guess they would
don't
have to, right?
Yeah, but they don't play anything else from this record at all live. Like the only
Yeah.
time they ever played this record live was to shoot this. And
Yeah.
they did like a 4 date run at a theater in their hometown.
hmm
One thing you'll notice is on the DVD, some of the songs don't have the same lyrics, and there's a
Hmm.
reason for that.
Okay.
They weren't finished.
Ah,
The
well, that
band
would do
had
it.
not, Daniel had not finished the lyrics to the record when they decided to do it live, which,
Okay.
I mean, that's a decision.
Well, yeah, like I've seen a couple of concerts where they've done that, where they have, like Stephen Wilson put out Luminal,
Right.
before it was finished
Oh, I remember
on Brace
that.
for Drowning. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Where Get All You Deserve, and I think IQ did it with their Frequency album. There were two tracks off of there that weren't quite finished, and so the lyrics are very different. You could see like, okay, we are pretty much done with this track. We're just fine tuning the the minor points there.
And and even though like there's a couple of tracks on the live version where like you can clearly tell Daniel's just kind of pulling words out of his rear end,
Yeah,
there is
yeah,
one bit at the very end of the record where like you know how Daniel likes to do these sort of spoken word bits now and then. I'd
yeah,
almost call them rap metal at
yeah.
times. And at the very, very end, after the last lyrics are sung, just before they go into the big tribal drumming thing, Daniel does a very impassioned sort of speech that ties together the concept really
Oh, there
well,
you go.
and it's absent on the studio version.
Yeah, yeah. Maybe
I,
he felt like it didn't quite fly, but
yeah,
that
maybe. I mean, yeah,
yeah,
go on.
I mean that reminded me of one of the negatives that I had, which was there's a lot of spoken word and kind of like these little vignettes, but I feel as if they're a little disjointed. Like we have a lot at the beginning, a lot at the end, and then a few in the middle. I would like to have those a little bit like spaced out a little bit, kind of like what Dream Theater was doing with their Awake album, where you had spoken word and
Like the movie
clips,
clips, yeah.
the movie
The
clips kind of, and it wasn't just a one-off at 6 o'clock, it wasn't just a one-off at Space Dyed Vest. There were kind of moments sprinkled throughout the album, and I think that would have kind of added a little bit more of unity
yeah.
to this
Although
album.
although that being said, some of them are kind of important to the plot, like
Oh,
that
absolutely.
that bit in between Nauticus and De Pecuniae where
Hmm.
Daniel's having his little tongue-in-cheek moment with Mr. Money and that girl.
Oh yeah,
But,
I just
but the
I got the ick real fast. I'm like, well, that's one way
kind
to
of kind of reminds I can't listen to Home by Dream Theater while I'm at work for the same reason. So it's but
yeah, but it's like, okay, yeah, it's a very good way of distilling his like personality, like this character right
but
away. I'm like,
the
oh,
fun
I'm
part
not
about
supposed to like
this,
this. Yeah.
yeah, but the fun part about it is you're not supposed to focus on what's happening in the foreground.
Yeah.
That's not the plot. It's
Yeah.
the background audio. It's the chattering in the background that's actually the important part to the story because that's where it's
Hmm.
talking about Mr. Money freezing himself and
Yeah.
that he only has the benefits of humanity at heart.
Oh boy. All
So,
right.
well, all right, we're getting long in this one.
Hey, that's all right. I
So,
was expecting that. So let's move on to the final piece of this, which is the Platinum Concept Album Test. This is where we run this album through 5 questions, and depending on how many it gets, it's this arbitrary, very fun, doesn't really matter what kind of a status this gets. So if it doesn't get any, it gets a trash.
oh
It's a trash
boy.
album. Yeah.
Well,
So
it's
if
not going
it
to be a trash album.
if it gets zero out
Tell you
of
that.
five, then it's if yeah, 0 out of 5, it's trash. If it only gets one, then it's tin. If it gets two, it's bronze. Three is silver. Four is gold. And if it gets all five, 5 out of 5, it gets platinum. So we will run through these 5 questions. And the
Okay. And
first question to
I've
run this through.
I've
Mhm.
heard these questions on other episodes, and I love these questions. I've been looking forward to answering these questions all week.
I'm so pleased. I'm so pleased. Okay, so the first question, now that you've had the pump prime, so you know what we're going to get into. First question is this concept original? Is this an original concept?
That's a hard one to answer because I mean, how many other bands have 6 pages of liner notes about creation myths and population figures and um, cryogenics in their liner notes? But I mean, the oldest story to time is a creation myth. It's kind of something we all sort of it's an internalized story we all kind of know about, like whether it's, Genesis in the Bible or
Hmm.
the Big Bang Theory or,
Hmm.
whatever. But as a concept album, as an album made by a progressive rock band in the 20th to 21st centuries, I'd say it's pretty original. There's not a lot of other bands that would think to do something this grandiose and pretentious, but also this deep. I think
Yeah,
it's definitely original.
I agree
for
in that, like,
better and worse.
yeah, like I agree that this is definitely like it's an old idea. You know, it's one of the first big questions that humanity ever asked, which was like, how did we get here? Is there something bigger than us? But I think it's within the execution that makes it original, like our relationship with that and what does that relationship look like? And I think that it's the expression that is quite original. Some of the stories and some of the albums that we've covered before, which is like semi autobiographical,
Right.
we're not dealing with that here. We're dealing more with like the internal struggles. It's so interesting because this album is both a very massive look at it, but also a very personal one. I think this is a very low bar, and that's why I always put this one on here. And I think that this one clears it very easily. I think that this one
Yeah.
is for
All
sure
right, not
a contest.
trash.
It's not trash. Yeah, so that's 1 out of 5. I think
I think we
one
can
of
give it that
five.
one.
We can give this one a pass. The second one, and this one is going to be an interesting conversation.
Oh
Second
boy.
question is, does the music reinforce the themes of the concept?
I think it does. I mean,
Mhm.
especially like we were talking about how there was this progression through like sort of the history and the future of mankind, and even how it winds down at the end. There's a real flow to the record's music, although the music is really all over the place. You have everything
Mhm.
from acoustic folk and tribal drumming to, Broadway musical, Disney style fun fests to traditional progressive metal, if there
Mhm.
ever was such a thing as traditional progressive metal, and pretty much everything in between. I mean, there's so much going on with the music on this record, and yet it does have a cohesive and coherent flow. It
Mhm.
does feel like the music tells the story of the lyrics to me, and that it actually goes somewhere. It's not just like, even though the music is so all over the place,
Yeah.
the story isn't all over the place. It does kind of serve as a series of vignettes, and I could easily see, like, even though they did kind of flirt with the idea on this, I could easily see this being sort of reinterpreted as a real like theatrical stage production with
Mhm.
characters and with maybe not so much like a narrative sort of thing, but like a sort of like maybe a weird dance interpretation or a ballet kind of thing. Like, I could see it turned into something like that. Yeah, I think the music really reinforces the narrative and the theme, you know?
Mhm.
There's some real dark and desperate moments on this record, and it's really reflected in the music sometimes. But there's
Yeah, and I
also a lot of joy and a lot of hope, and that's also there.
yeah, I mean, I struggle with this one in this album only because like when we're dealing with the divine and we're dealing with kind of beings that are outside of humanity, I was hoping for like, the big symphonic, like I'm thinking of like Tales of Topographic Ocean,
Yeah.
um, kind of, yes, the big like playing to the divine. That's another album that the whole concept is our relationship with God.
Wow,
And
I never thought to connect these two records, but
there you go. This is why we do
there
it.
you go.
Um, so like that was kind of the only thing that I feel I don't want to even say like it was lacking, right? But like I was really hoping to have that kind of that this music theme is talking about the creator. This music theme is talking about the humans, and this music theme is talking about greed or regret or wonder. And in that sense, because we're tackling with those different themes that are going on in this album, I didn't quite get within the music. Now, I'm whinging about what's not there rather than talking about what is there. Um, and I do want to echo kind of your point, which is, when we're dealing with some heavy concepts, the album gets heavy, it gets pretty dark. When we're talking about happy or sad, like really regretful music, it's very somber, it's very moving in that sense. I'm kind of 2 minds about this one, but I think at the end of the day, what we have on the album does reinforce the concept of the theme. So I'm okay giving this one a pass as well, with a little bit of like the caveat of like,
Like an
but
asterisk.
a little bit of an asterisk, right? It's not a clean pass. There had to be a little bit of photo finish, refs going back into the back booth to check out the footage one more time just to make sure.
As a
Um,
NASCAR fan, I appreciate that.
I think that's true about any
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 sport.
sport. Yeah, I mean, I've been watching the Olympics a lot these past 2 weeks, and so there's been a lot of, oh, we just got to go back into the booth and double check the tape. These next two are always the moments where the albums can trip.
Okay.
So this is the one that we're going to see, because this is the question that I'm most worried that this one probably won't pass, but we'll see. Question three. Is it accessible to a casual listener? Can someone off the street sit down and listen to it and enjoy it?
Here's the interesting thing. I have experience with this,
Okay.
and um, mostly with the live DVD version.
Sure.
I have gotten a number of my friends into Pain of Salvation because of this album.
I would agree in that out of all of the other Pain of Salvation albums, this one is probably the most kind to a new listener.
And it's
So I would
also
agree to that.
just in the fact that it's such a bold artistic statement, it makes a bigger impression. Like if the first record you hear from them, even if it's Remedy Lane or The Perfect Element Part 1, which are by many accounts perfect records, they might not leave as strong of an impression for a first time listener who's never. I mean, my first exposure to this band was tracks from those two records, and
Mhm.
I was kind of a little on the fence about the band for a while until I really dug deep. It was actually B that made me a fan.
Well, and I think with
And
those two records, the music is much more challenging. Like there's a lot more intricacy within time signatures. There's a lot more kind of grading
it's
against traditional metal music of the day,
but it's
you know?
also more traditional prog metal. It's more like
Mhm.
it's designed to appeal to fans of bands like Dream Theater and Symphony X and all that.
Yeah.
Whereas this album is you're not aiming for like the Dream Theater guys. You're aiming for like the theater kids and the art
Mhm.
school majors, and
Mhm.
it's really more geared towards like that sort of intelligentsia kind of audience. And that does mean it is a bit of a mark against this album being for casual listening because
Yes.
we've already spoken at length about how there isn't really a standout single. This is a devoted sit down and listen to the record and take it all in. And but for those who have the patience and for those
Mhm.
who have the open mindedness, I've had some really incredible results showing this album to people. I've had people, close friends of mine, showing the live version of this in absolute awe of what they've seen after it's done, like as if I've shown them like the greatest work of art they've seen. No, I don't think this record is good for casual first time listeners. I don't think this is an album that is gonna like spice up your road trip. But I do think that this is like it's a no with an asterisk because I do think there is a crowd of people that would really come into this album and appreciate it and see it as more than just a musical album, but as an experience, as a
Sure, sure.
yeah,
And I think that's true for any concept album. And I think this is why I put this question in here because it does kind of separate those albums from finding the fan base. Like this album, I think more than any other Pain of Salvation, maybe for except for Remedy Lane and the Perfect Element, um, is one that will catch more people into the Pain of Salvation fan base. But this isn't like a Tommy or American Idiot or whatnot, where like somebody off the street can be like, "Oh, that was a great time," right? Like I've never listened to The Who or Green Day before, but I enjoyed the music that was on there.
right.
Like this is one where they'll sit down and like you will know if they're going to be a Pain of Salvation fan or not after this album. I think part of the reason why I include this record or this question rather um, is that it's really hard to make something accessible for everybody, and that's why I
Yeah,
wanted to
and
include this because
I
I've had
I have had one negative reaction to this record.
sure,
Surprisingly, my ex partner of 10 years. I showed it to her and she didn't get it.
sure, yeah,
She
and that's
just
going to happen, right?
she was
So
like, "Oh, there was a couple nice musical moments in there, but I'm yeah."
Yeah. And
because she wasn't really bothered with the lyrical subject matter. It wasn't really something that she was interested in.
mhm,
If you don't have the patience or the open mindedness for it, it's not going to do anything for you.
absolutely. Absolutely. So yeah, I think much like the last question was a pass, but like kind of a photo finish. This one is a fail also because of the photo finish.
Yeah,
It's like, well,
it's a fail with an asterisk.
correct, correct, correct.
If you're the
Um,
right kind of person, this album is accessible, but you gotta be the right kind of person.
yeah, yeah. Which is why I love music, right? That's pretty much for all music.
It turns out I'm
Um,
the right kind of person for this record, so
there you go. So yeah, so unfortunately that is 2 for 3. We move on to the fourth question, which is the music solid from start to finish? Are there any dips in quality or any duds in the track lengths?
I don't think so. I think this is one of those solid start to finish records. I don't think there's a single note misplaced on this record.
Hmm.
I think every musical moment from start to finish is well thought out, well executed, and yeah, I can't really think of any moment on this record where I go, yeah, I kind of wish this bit was shorter. I kind of wish this bit was in a different key, or I wish they had gone in this direction instead of that direction. Like I can't think of a single moment on this record like this. It's impeccable, in my opinion.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, I've only had a couple months or a couple weeks with this one, so I'm not quite as glowing of a review that you have. But I will say, like, there's no dips, right? Like,
Right,
unlike other albums where I've listened to it, I'm like, oh, that track is a skip, or that track doesn't do anything for me. Like each track at least either builds on the track that came before or does something new. There's nothing on here that I feel is treading water or is same or it's just kind of like,
although
okay.
there are
Mhm.
some callbacks though, like at the ending where it calls back to Imago. So
Oh, sure,
you
sure,
know,
sure, sure. But
so
what
you
I'm
got
saying
the
is,
Tesseract meme of when the album brings back the theme,
yeah, and that's
which I
what I like.
love.
And same here, but like, there's a difference between like making two songs that sound exactly the same, and then
Right,
having a song reprise a theme from before in
right.
the album. So I am all for bands reprising themes. I am not for a band writing the same three songs over and over and over again. So yeah,
Pigs
and
on the Wing.
well, even with Pigs on the Wing, it's
That
it's
was kind of
recalling the
one
theme.
song and then it got
It's
split
it's
too. So
exactly. Like I'm thinking more in the vein of like Dream Theater's The Astonishing, where half of the
right,
songs are just the same thing over and over and over again.
brother, can
Right?
you hear me?
Yeah, it's
Yeah,
like, okay, well, see, that's a theme though, and that theme comes through, and I'm okay with that. It's like
yeah,
entire tracks that are like, okay, well, this track was just the same as that track, that's the same as that track, and even though you're
right,
progressing the storyline, you're not doing anything with the music.
right.
So yeah, that is devoid on this record. That luckily does not happen on this record. So I am better giving this one a pass without any kind of asterisks or any kind of photo finish. I'm
All right,
okay giving this one. Yeah.
that's 3 out of 5 so far.
So far, so yeah, for
So
we're
far,
three
so
for
good.
four, 3 for 4. We're coming up to the last one. We're going to see if this
Okay.
one is going to finish it with a silver or a gold. Because right now we're at silver out of 3 out of 5. We're going to see if we can bump it up to a gold. And the last question is the album the perfect length? Is it too long or too short?
Traditionally, I tend to be an advocate for shorter records,
Yep, same.
but I think that there's something to a record when it has enough length to tell its story without bogging down.
Hmm.
And there's a real art to that. I mean, look at the vast gulf of difference between, say, Aryon's The Human Equation and Dream Theater's The Astonishing, which are both incredibly long records, but both have incredibly different results when you try to listen to them in one sitting.
Yeah.
So I think that you can make a longer record that does feel like it's worth that extra time, and I do think B fits the mold for that. I don't think it's too long. I think that it's just about the perfect length. I'm not. I don't
Mhm.
actually remember exactly how long this record is. Hoping it might say on
According,
the CD.
yeah, it's an hour and 15 minutes.
So it's
Um,
it's about the length of a full CDR.
yeah, so
That's a reference for you older folks watching.
yeah, us
Remember burning
millennials.
CDs?
Oh, I remember 80 minutes. That was the sweet spot. Yeah, like I am glad that they decided to keep this as one disc. I feel if you brought it into two, it might get bogged down. It
If they
might
tried to airy on this, it wouldn't have worked.
I think you would have got lost in the sauce, and I'm glad that they told the story that they wanted to tell in its time. The album justifies its length. So I wouldn't necessarily say that it is too short because I think if you tried to cut some things here and there, like the only thing that I would do in order to save space on this CD would ultimately cut itself off at the knees. Like I would remove the character of Moneybags or Mr. Money and just focus in on the relationship between the divine and the humans. But you're
But then
taking
you'd
out my
miss out.
favorite. Yeah, you're
Yeah,
missing
you're
out on my
missing out
favorite
on
parts
some
of the
great
album,
moments.
right? So like that would be the only thing that I would like shorten it down to say like a 50-minute runtime or like a 45-minute runtime. But why? Why would I want to do that? So yeah, I think for the album that they're trying to do and the concept that they're trying to implement, I think this is the proper length. I'm glad that they
Right.
didn't go 2 discs, and I'm glad that they didn't go any shorter. So
It's it's
yeah,
about it's about the perfect length.
it's the perfect length for what it needs to be. If this was an album that wasn't a concept album, I'd be like, guys, you got to shave off at least 20 minutes. But because they're able to justify the length, I'm fine with it.
It's
So
exactly as long as it's needed to be for my pleasure.
there you go. There you go. So another clean pass, which elevates that from a silver to a gold. We have a final rating of 4 out of 5 questions passed as a gold record. So B is a gold record according to our books, which is, completely objective and the absolute truth when it comes to musical endeavors in this case. And that also brings us to the end of our little show. So thank you, Travis, coming on and chatting about B.
It was a pleasure.
Once again, where can people find you?
I am on OnlyFans. No, I'm on Bandcamp. Uh, Geez, this was easy. This was easy an hour and a half ago. Bandcamp, Spotify, and Apple Music as Borealia.
Mhm.
It's just Boreal with IA at the end for my original music, and long words on songwords without any spaces or capitals .blogspot.com for my blog, and long words on songwords on YouTube. And if you're interested, just look up my real name on Ultimate Guitar, and you'll probably see a whole bunch of guitar tabs and album reviews I've written in the past for a wide variety of genres and bands.
Amazing. Yeah, and I've left all that information down below for you guys to go and check out. And yeah, that brings us to the end. I still haven't figured out a sign off for this. I'm like 5 episodes in and I haven't figured out something to say. So I guess until our next episode, thanks everybody for watching, and we'll catch you in the next one.
Yeah, what a concept.
What a concept.